Tom and Jerry at the movies and where movie magic comes to life. The Disney MGM Studios at the Walt Disney World Resort in Florida.
Yes, what you just saw was real. There was a time where you could meet Tom and Jerry in Walt Disney World. You see, back in 1989, when Disney's Hollywood studio opened, it was originally called Disney MGM Studios. And as they were more open to present non-Disney IPs to the park, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and the fact that the duo were some of the most recognizable characters under the MGM brand, they were able to become meet and greet characters during the first few years of the park. In fact, that commercial you just saw was released in 1993, as it was meant to simultaneously promote Tom and Jerry the movie. But obviously, times have changed, and nowadays, it is impossible to go to Disney World and hope that you could get a picture with Tom and Jerry. But what if I tell you that Tom and Jerry are still in Disney's Hollywood studios today? If you go and grab a bite at the Sci-Fi Dine-In, amongst all the old cheesy sci-fi movies that they show on the big screen, one of them is the 1962 Tom and Jerry short, Mouse into Space. And considering that we're talking about a Gene Deitch cartoon, it fits perfectly with the restaurant's cheesiness. We've all heard about the stories about how much of a nightmare it is to work on visual effects or in animation. Rather it be working on the effects at Marvel Studios, or enduring the toxic work ethic of Phil Lord and Chris Miller. But what about the opposite of that? What about a wholesome story where during the production of a movie, the animators were well treated? During the production of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, director Jeff Rowe noticed an admirable quality about producers Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg. With their production company Point Grey, whenever they would make movies, they always make sure that the people who work for them have a good work-life balance. And considering that Jeff experienced being in a toxic work environment by working with Phil Lord and Chris Miller on The Mitchells vs. the Machines, Rowe and the producers agreed to put the well-being of the cast and crew as one of the top priorities, making sure that not only would Mutant Mayhem be the best that it could be, but making sure that the animators are not overworked so that they could always be at their best when working on the film. Moral of the story? In a world filled with Lords and Millers, be a Jeff Rowe. Nimona is an animation miracle, where we once thought it was gone forever when Blue Sky Studios shut down, but then it revived and it became one of the best movies of the year. And as much as we love to portray Disney as the villains for indirectly and nearly canceling Nimona by shutting down Blue Sky, did you know that Disney also served as the inspiration for the animation of Nimona? I was one of those people that thought that the movie was following the visual trend of Spider-Verse, but its true inspiration came from the Oscar-winning Disney animated shorts Paperman and Feast. In fact, the director of Feast, Patrick Osborne, was helming Nimona while it was in production at Blue Sky. And when you compare the animation of the shorts and Nimona, you'll find that they are a legit match. Other inspirations for Nimona's animation include the original comic that it's based on by N.D. Stevenson, American artist Charlie Harper, and Ivan Earl, whom you may know the latter as the guy who created the art style for Disney's Sleeping Beauty. So even if Disney almost took down Nimona, they did do some good for the movie by giving them some inspiration. Out of all the Disney facts out there, this one is easily among the craziest. During the 1990s, when Disney was producing Fantasia 2000, then CEO Michael Eisner had an idea for one of the segments. After attending his son's graduation, he wanted a segment that revolves around the music of Pomp and Circumstance, and even came up with a plotline that would go with it. In Eisner's version, all the Disney princesses would simultaneously get married to their respective prince, and at the same time, they would be shown as pregnant, each of them carrying their future baby as they walked down the aisle. But when Eisner proposed the idea to the animation team, they were horrified. Not only because this big wedding makes it sound like the princesses were part of this freaky cult performing a ritual, not to mention that the pregnancies make it sound like they all had to breed at the same time, but especially that the princesses are technically underage. On average, the Disney princesses are around 16 years old each. So if they are depicted as pregnant, it would give off the idea that all these underage princesses were canonically deflowered. And I know that didn't stop Disney from making The Little Mermaid 2, but that's a completely different story. So as you can imagine, that idea got completely scrapped. But Eisner was still adamant that they would use Pomp and Circumstance. What the animation team ultimately came up with was a story based on Noah's Ark. And then later, they updated it to be a more comedic take of the story that would revolve around Noah's apprentice, played by Donald Duck, resulting in the segment that we have today. And no matter what people would say about that part in Fantasia 2000, it could have been so much worse. In honor of the 100th anniversary of not just the Walt Disney Company, but also 100 years of Disney animation, they released a special animated short called Once Upon a Studio, directed by Dan Abraham and Trent Corey, and it is noted to be one of the biggest cartoon crossovers yet. In total, there are 543 individual Disney characters from over 85 different projects who come to life in the studio. And not only do they come from every single Disney animated film release from Snow White to Wish, but they also come from various Disney animated shorts, live action productions, and some miscellaneous works. As for their voices, they say over 40 actors were brought into the short, but I counted give or take 51 actors hired for Once Upon a Studio, 29 of which were the original actors who reprised their roles, on top of 28 characters voiced by archived recordings. And for the hand-drawn animation, not only did Disney use their 2D team that includes Randy Haycock and Mark Henn, and led by Eric Goldberg, but they also brought back 5 animators from the Disney Renaissance era to redraw their characters, including James Baxter, Ruben Aquino, Nick Ranieri, Will Finn, and Tony Bancroft, all to bring the literally hundreds of classic characters to life to mix and mingle with the 3D ones. And as a lifelong Disney fan myself, I can honestly say that this is the 100th anniversary tribute that Disney deserves. Walt himself would have been proud of this one. The Nightmare Before Christmas is one of Disney's most prominent Halloween theme IPs next to Hocus Pocus and the Haunted Mansion. But did you know that Disney wanted to disassociate themselves from the movie on its initial release? Originally, they wanted The Nightmare Before Christmas to be part of the official Disney animation lineup. Even the marketing would go as far as to compare the film to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 101 Dalmatians, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Beauty and the Beast.
From the beginning, Walt Disney established a tradition of innovation. From the world's first full-length animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, to the new photographic techniques introduced in 101 Dalmatians, the combination of animation and live action in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and the dazzling use of computer technology in Beauty and the Beast. Now, Walt Disney Pictures is joining forces with Tim Burton, the creative genius behind Batman, Beetlejuice, and Edward Scissorhands, to bring you one of the most unique and innovative movies of our time, The Nightmare Before Christmas.
But then came Batman Returns. At the time, the movie was controversial because it was considered to be too violent and too extreme for families. And it did cause some consequences on its box office performance. And considering that Disney was ready to release their Tim Burton-style movie, they got a bit scared. As a result, on Nightmare's original release, instead of releasing it as an official Disney animated film, they put it out under their adult label, Touchstone Pictures, on top of giving it a PG rating, which at the time was considered very rare for an animated film to have. And over time, the popularity of The Nightmare Before Christmas gradually grew from being a modest sleeper hit to a cultural phenomenon. And the more popular the movie got, the more the company is open to say that the movie is part of the Disney family. And nowadays, they cannot be more proud to say so. So Disney pretty much went from being quiet about their involvement to never shutting up about how The Nightmare Before Christmas is a Disney movie. The Road to El Dorado is considered to be one of the most underrated movies of all time. But thanks to social media boosting its popularity, it is now considered to be one of the most beloved movies from DreamWorks Animation. But did you know that the feature is actually a tribute to an already existing film franchise? Yes, it is no mistake that the movie is called The Road to El Dorado, since the feature is based on the Road to film series. It is a set of movies that were released between 1940 and 1962. Although most of them were released in the 1940s. And despite that the actors don't play the same characters in each movie and that they're technically not a part of the same universe, they're all connected because they all share similar themes and share a similar title. Each of them feature the comedic duo of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby as they travel into what was considered at the time exotic places. They include the road to Singapore, the road to Zanzibar, the road to Rio, the road to Hong Kong, and more. Also, like El Dorado, each movie would include show-stopping musical numbers, and they each have their own version of Chell played by Dorothy Lamour. It is worth noting though that DreamWorks wasn't the only one who made a Road 2 animated tribute. Another notable example is Family Guy, where the series has its own set of special episodes where Stewie and Brian would go on their own Road 2 musical adventure. So before there was Tulio and Miguel, there was Bob and Bing. Disney's Robin Hood is considered by many to be a fan favorite. But did you know that the movie was responsible for one of the first ever internet memes? Back in 1998, Canadian art student Deidre Lacarte played around on the internet making websites, specifically little web pages featuring a character based on her pet hamster, Hampton Hamster. One of these was a single-page site called hamsterdance.com, to which it only featured a bunch of GIFs of dancing hamsters and a 9-second audio loop of a sped-up version of the song Whistle Stop, the song that Alan Adale plays during the opening credits of Robin Hood. And over time, the website was gradually gaining popularity. But when it truly became viral was in the year 2000, when the website was turned into an actual song that they called, well, the Hamster Dance song. And it quickly later became a top charting hit. And its success went full circle when it became one of the most popular tunes on Radio Disney. And that is the story of how a song played by a rooster is now associated with a bunch of dancing hamsters. You probably have heard how Coyote vs. Acme had been making the news recently. Seriously, that whole situation sounds like one wild Looney Tunes cartoon in itself. But in case you don't know the full picture, here's a quick history of Coyote vs. Acme. Or at least, the history so far. Inspired by a humorous New Yorker article, Coyote vs. Acme is an animation live-action hybrid movie where Wile E. Coyote takes the Acme Corporation to court after the hundreds of failed gadgets that he purchased from them. And it had plenty of prominent talents making it, including a cast featuring John Cena, Will Forte, and Lana Connor, Dave Green as the director, and the story was written by James Gunn. And during production, everybody had only positive things to say about it. Everybody who worked on the project was very enthusiastic about it, test audiences were always positive, and other filmmakers who saw the movie being made called it the best Looney Tunes movie. Everything was going great for Coyote vs. Acme. That was until November 9th of 2023, when Warner Brothers decided to just cancel it. They promised they wouldn't do it again after the incident with Batgirl and Scoop Holiday Haunt, but they decided to shelve it just to get a $30 million tax credit, even if it had a budget of around $70 million. As a result, Warner Brothers received massive backlash from both the public and from Hollywood. And it became so bad that the company had no choice but to reverse course, where now they're putting Coyote vs. Acme on sale in the hopes that a streaming platform could go and buy it and that they would go and distribute it. So the good news is that the movie got a second chance, but the damage that Warner Brothers got was already done. David Zaslav is in competition with Elon Musk for the title of the worst CEO in modern times. Filmmakers have canceled their meetings with the studio because now they justifiably got trust issues. And even Congressman Joaquin Castro is calling for the US government to investigate the company, because now politicians are starting to suspect foul play. Out of all the Looney Tunes movies, this is already the craziest one. And I haven't even seen the movie yet! It's been 10 years since Frozen was released and became one of the biggest animation phenomenons. But did you know that it took Disney over 70 years to bring that story to life? Their first attempt of an adaptation of The Snow Queen was back in the late 1930s and early 1940s, as part of a collection of animated shorts for an Hans Christian Andersen biography that Disney was collaborating with MGM. But ultimately, that project had to be scrapped so that Disney could set their focus entirely on World War II. It wasn't until the 1990s when Disney tried another shot at adapting The Snow Queen, mainly to try to recapture the magic of The Little Mermaid. But no matter how many times Disney would keep on trying over the years, they still were not able to get the story right, especially when it comes to the Snow Queen herself to make her a more likable villain. Even when Chris Buck and Jennifer Lee were brought on board as the writers and directors, and were able to figure out all the other pieces of the story, the Snow Queen was always their biggest challenge to figure out. It wasn't until the early 2010s when songwriters Robert and Kristen Anderson Lopez entered the scene, and decided to experiment with a villain song. Instead of making a straightforward villainous musical number, they decided to write a song that would make her look more sympathetic and vulnerable. Something where she no longer feels like her fears are controlling her. and that she got her first taste of freedom to be herself. And that song was called Let It Go. Sure, the filmmakers had to rewrite the whole first act to accommodate the song, but they knew that they had something special, and most importantly, that song helped them found their Snow Queen. And the rest, I guess you could say, is Arendelle history. When you learn multiple languages, it actually helps to see how other cultures view the world. And as someone who can speak both in English and in French, I know that there could be certain names and words that can be completely different in different languages. And that is especially the case with the names of some Disney characters. There are some that can be a direct translation, like Oncle Picsou is actually French for Uncle Scrooge. And there are those that don't change their names at all, like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck are exactly that in French. But then things start to get weird with Goofy. You want to know what the French call him? Dingo. And it's even weirder when you say it in English because his name is Dingo. Why the French decided to give him the most Australian name they could think of, that I don't know. Then you got Chip and Dale, whom the French call them Tic et Tac, which honestly isn't too bad, because now you can have the option of thinking of the chipmunks as either breath mints or sexy dancers. But the weirdest of them all has to be Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And what do the French decide to call the trio? Riri, Fifi, et Loulou. What the French kind of names are those? They don't sound like mischievous boys. Those are names you give to tiny dogs that women carry in their purses. I tell ya, learning French can be both a blessing and a curse. We all know how cartoons are crazy for Christmas. But what about the other holidays like Hanukkah? Yes, there have been some animated projects that highlight the holidays, such as the Rugrats, Simpsons, South Park, and 8 Crazy Nights. But the first representation of Hanukkah in animation is An American Tail in 1986. Now, I know that it doesn't count as a holiday movie, let alone a Hanukkah movie, but the opening scene features the Mousekewitz family celebrating Hanukkah, and it presents how Fievel received his signature hat as a gift, and thus show that even animated characters celebrate more than just Christmas during the holidays.
Happy Hanukkah.
Now, if only there are more characters who celebrate Kwanzaa. I looked it up, and animation representation of that holiday is actually nearly mythological. We all know the biggest success story of 2023 was the unlikely duo of Barbie and Oppenheimer. The fact that they were released at the same time played a key role in making both of them the biggest cinematic event that we have seen in years. But did you know that several decades ago, Japan had a Barbenheimer of their own? Back in April of 1988, Studio Ghibli released a double feature of two very opposite films, Hayao Miyazaki's My Neighbor Totoro and Isao Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies. Now, keep in mind that back then, Studio Ghibli was still a relatively new studio, and this was meant to be a showcase to highlight what they could do. But on the initial release of the double feature, it didn't really do that great. I mean, some people went to go and watch My Neighbor Totoro, but many of them skipped out on Grave of the Fireflies. Mainly because after getting a taste of that whimsical joy from Totoro, they don't want to immediately ruin it with a tragic story about two struggling Japanese orphans at the end of World War II. However, over time, both these movies would have a happy ending. On top of receiving universal acclaim from both critics and audiences, the merchandise of Totoro was a big help in order to make both films profitable. And over time, both My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies are often regarded as two of the greatest Japanese movies of all time. Kind of funny to see how these unlikely duo stories always work out in the world of cinema. You remember Tickle Me Elmo, right? In fact, there's a good chance that you used to own one. But did you know that the toy was very close to being a completely different character? And no, you probably couldn't guess who it originally was. It wasn't Big Bird, it wasn't Ernie, it wasn't Cookie Monster. It was originally the Tasmanian Devil. Yes, Tickle Me Elmo was close to being Tickle Me Taz. When the toy company Tyco created the prototype in the mid-1990s, it used to be this original monkey called Tickle Me Chimp. But they figured that it would be best if it were a familiar character so that they could have better sales. And since they got the licensing to make Looney Tunes toys, they decided to turn their monkey into a Tickle Me Taz. However, the only problem was that kids weren't really into it. Let's just say that the Tasmanian Devil is not the most likely that kids would like to go and tickle. And since their Looney Tunes license expired, Tyco had to find a plan B. To which they went to get the license of Sesame Street, and decided to go with a character that is not only more friendly, but seems like he would be a lot of fun to tickle, Elmo. And thus began the toy phenomenon that made people go crazy in toy stores in 1996. Seriously, people have the scars to prove it. It's 2024, and the moment we've been waiting for has finally arrived. Mickey Mouse is in the public domain. Or at least, his earliest version in his first cartoons like Plain Crazy and Steamboat Willie. So that pretty much means we could do whatever we want with the character, right? About that. Technically, yes, the early Mickey Mouse is in the public domain. But his trademark, which is like a variant of a copyright, still belongs to Disney. And as long as Disney keeps using that image of Mickey in any capacity, that trademark does not expire. And I can guarantee you that the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey's trademark is very strong. Especially when they're still using it as part of their logo for Walt Disney Animation Studios ever since 2007. But the craziest part is that while everybody was focused on Mickey, Disney was actually practicing for this moment while nobody noticed. Disney fans have noticed that they have been using Oswald the Lucky Rabbit a lot more than usual, giving him more appearances and be featured in a lot more merch. It was the most that we have seen Oswald since the early 2010s with the Epic Mickey games. And the reason they did so was because in 2023, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit entered the public domain. And I can assure you, whatever they practice on Oswald, they will absolutely try that out on Mickey. And I know that this is a very complicated subject where trademarks are not necessarily the same as copyright, but knowing how Disney lawyers are, they will be doing a lot of legal gymnastics to make a statement that, public domain or not, Mickey Mouse is forever theirs. By the way, if you like more info about this entire situation, I highly recommend checking out the YouTube video on this subject by DSNY News. He actually did a great job summarizing this entire case. So I know that many people are gonna say that the early Mickey Mouse is free game, but with Disney around, that game is called F Around and Find Out. Ever since 2024 began, the entire internet went crazy over the fact that Steamboat Willie entered the public domain. But it honestly shows that the people who are the most excited for that don't actually know what that means. Luckily, animation veteran and illustrator Dave Alvarez created a Facebook post explaining everything of what you can and cannot do with Mickey Mouse now that Steamboat Willie is in the public domain. And I'll be relaying that message to you by reading the list. Also, I highly recommend you go and follow Dave Alvarez because he's honestly an amazing artist. So let's start off by going through what you cannot do. First off, you cannot create another black and white mouse and call it Mickey Mouse. Regardless if he looks completely different or identical to the mouse in Steamboat Willie, don't go calling him Mickey. In fact, just don't ever use the name Mickey Mouse, period. Because Disney has the name trademarked and that's not going to change anytime soon. Also, you cannot market or sell the image of Mickey Mouse. So for those of you hoping that you can make a fortune just by making products and slapping the Steamboat Willie image on it, well, have I got bad news for you. And finally, the copyright law didn't give you a New Year's gift. You don't own Mickey Mouse. So when you see all those influencers saying that Mickey Mouse is free or that Mickey Mouse belongs to the people, sorry, but that's not the truth. That's just clickbait. So in that case, what can you do? Well, in that regard, the public has gained the right to creatively use the first black and white Disney characters strictly as they appear in the 1928 animated short film Steamboat Willie, as well as the year's silent version of the short film Plain Crazy. So that pretty much means that you are creatively allowed to do whatever you wish with that particular version of Mickey, Minnie, Peg-Leg Pete, and all the animals that Mickey tortured for his musical amusement. However, keep in mind that you can only use these versions of Mickey and Minnie. You are not allowed to use any of the versions that came out afterwards because those are still protected by copyright. Also, here's a quick tip, don't ever give your mouse gloves, because that cartoon mouse with gloves is actually protected by trademark. However, don't forget that you still have fair use on your side. I highly recommend that you do research on that so that you can open up your options on what more can you do with the mouse. So with all that clarified, hopefully this will safely guide you on how to creatively use Steamboat Willie without getting into trouble. Just please don't make any more horror projects. I have here the list of all the animated films that are going to be coming out in 2024. And keep in mind as I'm reading this that nothing is set in stone and there is a chance in the future that this might change. So starting things off, there are going to be 2 animated features that will be released on the same day on streaming. These include The Tiger's Apprentice on Paramount Plus and DreamWorks' Orion in the Dark on Netflix. And speaking of DreamWorks, not long after, they're going to release Kung Fu Panda 4 on the big screen, which will then be followed by the Garfield movie, the anticipated Inside Out 2, and another 4th installment with Despicable Me 4. Then there's going to be Transformers 1, and then DreamWorks will release one more animated film with The Wild Robot, to which then Disney Animation will put out something. Although as of this video, we don't know what it is yet. Next it will be The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. I hope I said that right. And finally, Mufasa the Lion King, because technically it counts as an animated film. But I'm not done yet. There are also some animated films that as of this video don't have a release date yet, but they say that they're coming out in 2024. These include The Day the Earth Blew Up, a Looney Tunes movie, the R-rated 2D animated film called Fix, and a whole bunch of Netflix movies, including In Your Dreams, Saving Bikini Bottom the Sandy Cheeks movie, Spellbound, That Christmas, Thelma the Unicorn, and finally, the one they'll probably hype up the most, Ultraman Rising. So which one are you most excited for? Recently, I've come to realize that one of the most colorful animated series that you can find is Hazbin Hotel. Now, I don't mean that literally with the color palette, because let's be honest, you gotta go through a lot of pinks and reds on that show. I mean that Hazbin Hotel has an entire rainbow's worth of LGBTQ+ representation. Seriously, think of any sexuality and there's a good chance that there's a character in that hell who is like that. Of course, there's a lot of bi characters, including Charlie. There's her partner Vaggie, who is a lesbian. And you don't have to watch Hazbin Hotel to know that Angel Dust is the gay one. There's Alistair, who is an aromantic asexual. And you got a bunch of pansexual characters like Husk and Valentino. And I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg in Vivzy Pop's hell. But there is a good reason why there's so many LGBTQ+ characters in the series. You see, Vivian Madrano herself is actually bisexual. And I wouldn't be surprised if Hazbin Hotel is a way to express herself and to give back to the rainbow community. Well, it does make sense since pride is considered a sin. But then again, considering how Christian nationalists are nowadays, we're pretty much in an age where the sinners are the good guys. There are some things that are so commonplace in our lives that we often take them for granted, down to the point where we completely forget where they come from in the first place. A great example of this is the word duh. I mean, have you ever thought where that word even came from in the first place? Yes, technically, the way that we would use the word in a sarcastic manner started back in the 1960s, but its true origins actually came from a cartoon. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the first time the word duh was used was actually in the 1943 Looney Tunes cartoon Jack Wabbit and the Beanstalk. It's your typical Bugs Bunny cartoon, but this time Bugs outsmarts a dumb giant. But in order to present that the giant's brain is silky smooth, Mel Blanc gave the giant a distinct way of talking.
Well, he can't outsmart me because I'm a moron.
And you know, this really does say a lot about cartoons. Because if they can create words that become so commonplace in our lives like duh, then they are far more influential than we give them credit for. Once Upon a Studio is a wonderful and heartfelt tribute to the 100 years of Disney animation. And one of the most pleasant moments of the short is to see the comeback of Robin Williams. During the scene when the genie emerges from the desk in front of Olaf, his voice is actually never before used archive footage of Robin Williams during the making of Aladdin. And don't worry, Disney did get permission from his family in order to use it.
I haven't seen a fall like that since Rome. Oh, much better.
But you know what's more surprising? That's not the only Robin Williams moment of the short. Just before the genie shows up, his caricature appears right beside Olaf. Now, this caricature here actually came from the 1989 film Back to Neverland. It was made for the attraction The Magic of Disney Animation, which was in Disney's Hollywood Studios in Walt Disney World. In the film, Walter Cronkite educates guests into how animated films are created. And to show the process, Robin Williams is turned into one of the Lost Boys from Peter Pan. But I will say that even though it's been almost a decade since he's gone, it's great to see a friend like him come back. To fill your heart this Valentine's Day, here are 5 loving voice acting couples. You may know Karen as Plankton's computer wife in SpongeBob SquarePants, but her voice actress Jill Talley is actually married to SpongeBob himself, Tom Kenny. Then we have Yuri Lowenthal and Tara Platt, who had 2 power couple moments in Ben 10. The first was when Yuri was Ben Tennyson and Tara was Jennifer Nocturne in Ultimate Alien, and then once more when they were Ben and Esther respectively in Omniverse. Oh, and I cannot forget to mention how they were Satsuki and Tamari in Naruto. There was also Mike Farrell and Shelley Fabars, who had to raise a superhero in the 1990s as Jonathan and Martha Kent in Superman the Animated Series. Then you have Travis Willingham and Laura Bailey, who make an oddly surprising duo, since that means that Colonel Roy Mustang from Full Metal Alchemist actually hooked up with Lust. And finally, my personal favorite, Wayne Allwine and Russi Taylor, whom for several decades, this couple were the actual voices of Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse. Who would have guessed that cartoons can be a great matchmaker? Hades is among one of the top fan favorite Disney villains. But did you know that it was an entire Herculean task for Disney to find the right actor to play the iconic god? The first actor they tried out for the role was Jack Nicholson, who was recommended by Danny DeVito. And while Nicholson was down to try out the part, he was asking for way too much, so Disney had to say no to him. Afterwards, they brought on board John Lithgow to try out Hades. And for several months, it seemed like he was the right choice. In fact, they were able to do some animation tests with his version.
Isn't this pleasant? I was just supposed to come along as an observer. Right now, what I'm observing is very odd.
Just show them in. I throw everything I've got at him, and it doesn't even... What?
But again, it ultimately didn't work out. And from there, several prominent actors tried and failed to audition for Hades. And some of these include Phil Hartman, Robert Evans, James Coburn, Martin Landau, and more. It wasn't until James Woods gave it a shot and was able to successfully turn him into the Disney villain we know him today. I know courtroom drama is not for everyone, but there can be some hilarious stories that come from it. And in the world of animation, one great example of that is from The Regular Show. And I'm not talking about an episode they did, I mean the actual series itself in the real world. Now, if you're a gamer, you're probably familiar with Billy Mitchell, who is known as the Elon Musk of video game players. And by that I mean all of his achievements are a lie, his ego is bigger than his brain, he's emotionally allergic to criticism, and now he is recognized by everyone as a complete laughingstock. Anyways, in the Regular Show episode High Score, it features a giant head who is a parody of Mitchell by the name of GBF. And of course, being as weak-minded as Elon Musk, Mitchell got his feelings hurt and he responded with a lawsuit against Cartoon Network for the misappropriated use of his likeness. But upon receiving the case, the judge immediately dismissed it, stating that Cartoon Network was in the right of doing so because they are protected by the First Amendment. And on top of that, the judge had to clarify to Mitchell that Cartoon Network did nothing wrong because Billy is literally not a giant head who explodes into goo. You know, there's a little bit of irony in this story. What started as just an obvious parody, Billy Mitchell turned it into life-imitating art. I have some good news and some bad news regarding Coyote vs. Acme. The good news is that we now know when you'll most likely see the movie. The bad news is that it's never. You're probably never gonna see it. In late February, it was revealed that Warner Bros. Discovery took $115 million by canceling a whole bunch of movies and turning them into tax write-downs. To which they say it's for their strategic realignment plan for Warner Bros. Pictures Animation. Which means that all those movies that they have canceled are animated features. And many have speculated that one of them is Coyote vs. Acme. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, whatever happened to those plans of trying to sell the movie to another distributor? Did nobody want to buy it? Actually, the WB did get a bunch of offers, including Netflix, Amazon, and even Paramount was willing to release it theatrically. The only problem was that Warner Brothers was being too greedy, where they were asking for $75 to $80 million with no room for negotiation. And I know the movie had a $70 million budget, but it's still pretty stupid to ask for that when they were ready to cancel the movie and only get half of that as a tax write-down. And from there, some of the actors from the movie have been more outspoken regarding the whole situation, including Will Forte, whom at first thought the movie was terrible when he first heard that the movie was being scrapped, but then he actually saw the movie and thought that it was incredible, and now is pretty sad that no one will get a chance to legit see it. And of course, you got the biggest supporter of Coyote vs. Acme, the voice of Wile E. Coyote in the film, Eric Bauza, who was very vocal about wanting the film to be released, even when he was hosting the Annie Awards.
I hate to be political, but relief! Coyote versus Acme!
But now that the future of Warner Bros. Discovery has become very uncertain, down to the point where they might be ready to sell the whole company or just merge with someone as soon as April, who knows if the fate of Coyote vs. Acme might change. But for now, it looks like we might never get to see Coyote vs. Acme, but the chances of it getting ultimately released are not zero. As we're getting ready for more Kung Fu Panda, I've actually discovered something very interesting, particularly with the third movie. You see, Kung Fu Panda 3 is the first mainstream Hollywood animated feature to be co-produced by a Chinese company. And just like with the previous two films, they really wanted this to be a big hit in the Asian country. So for the Chinese version of the movie, they decided to do something a little extra. Instead of doing the usual thing of just giving them the movie but with a Chinese dub, they partly reanimated the whole movie so that the characters' lip sync can also be Chinese. And just by looking at the results, I think it's safe to say that the Chinese were very happy with their own version of Kung Fu Panda.
This was the one destined to stop me.
How about you spare me the chit chat?
I'm going to take your
chit chat.
in this
Chitty chitty chat 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 chat.
in this
Chit chat.
难道我的宿命中的对手就是他吗？
天下也学会啰里啰嗦了。
我要夺走你的
啰里啰嗦，啰里啰嗦，啰里啰嗦，啰里啰嗦。
Pardon the little impromptu style, but I just had to talk about it now. So as you may know, the 2024 winner for Best Animated Feature is The Boy and the Heron. And even though some of you may be shocked over the fact that it wasn't Across the Spider-Verse, this win is actually a big deal for several reasons. This is the second time that not only Studio Ghibli won for Best Animated Feature, but this is also the second win for Hayao Miyazaki, the second time that an anime got an Oscar, and the second time that a 2D animated film won for Best Animated Feature. Also, not only is Hayao Miyazaki the first non-US person to win multiple Oscars for Best Animated Feature, but he is also the first person of color to do so. Speaking of which, this is the first time that a non-US animated film won for Best Animated Feature at the Oscars since Wallace and Gromit: Curse of the Were-Rabbit. This is also the first ever Oscar win for the distributor G-Kids, who have been nominated several times over the years for the independent animated features that they have released. Congratulations to the team at both Studio Ghibli and G-Kids for the big win. Oh, and also, congrats to the Godzilla -1 team for the best visual effects win. Seriously, even though it was Oppenheimer's big night, Japan won big at the Oscars. When DreamWorks Animation began development of Kung Fu Panda 4, the first challenge was to figure out how they can make the fourth movie stand out from its predecessors. And there was one idea that they almost went with, but they ultimately scrapped those plans. But in a recent interview with Kung Fu Panda 4's co-director Stephanie Ma Stein, we now know what those plans were. And nothing could prepare you for what it was. You know what they wanted to include in Kung Fu Panda 4? Humans! And not just any humans, live-action humans! Where Kung Fu Panda 4 was originally planned to be a live-action animation hybrid. And of course, the main humans would have been the new characters of Kung Fu Panda 4, including Zhen and the film's villain, the Chameleon, whom the latter was originally named the Collector. And yes, that would have been convoluted considering that General Kai in the third film is also called Kai the Collector. Oh, and get this! You know how in the fourth movie where Po and Zhen go to Juniper City? Not only that place would have been filled with people, but it would have also been called Who-Man City! As you can imagine, eventually, all those live-action plans was ultimately scrapped. Yet for a good while, they still kept the idea of having humans in Kung Fu Panda 4. It wasn't until they had their second screening of the animatic where they finally came to their senses and dropped the human plans altogether. We definitely dodged a bullet with that one. But just imagine that we were very close to having something like this be in the same world as this. Well, minus this, of course. Gravity Falls is a legendary series from beginning to end. But did you know that it was very close to only having one season and ending it all off with a cliffhanger? Imagine if Grunkle Stan would have all 3 journals, activate the portal, and that would be entirely it. And believe it or not, executives have nothing to do with this. As this was the first show he ever made, creator Alex Hirsch was overwhelmed by the entire process of making an animated show, and was ready to move on after finishing off the first season. But then, after the show became a massive hit, 2 people stepped in to help him change his mind. First, there was Over the Garden Wall creator Patrick McHale, who told him that after making that cliffhanger, he has to give the story a proper conclusion. And the second was Jon Stewart, whom his kids were big fans of the show. And as a result, Hirsch decided to go and make a second season. But when signing on with Disney for that, it came with one condition. Not only would this be the final season, but Alex had to keep that a secret from everyone. In fact, even the actors didn't know that it was the last season until they read the script for the multi-part Weirdmageddon, and thus giving us the perfect conclusion to Dipper and Mabel's unforgettable summer. We all know Who Framed Roger Rabbit as the home of the ultimate crossover. The legendary moment where we see the characters of Disney and Looney Tunes coming together. Along with many other tunes, of course. But did you know that this is not the first time that we see a crossover between these 2 studios? Back in the 1960s, there was a popular brand named Soki, to which they are bubble bath bottles in the shape of cartoon characters. And their gimmick is that once the bottles are empty, they can be repurposed as a toy. In 1964, Soki made a commercial that featured Donald Duck and Porky Pig. It starts out with the mascot, the Soki Kid, calling Donald Duck,
"Hello, Donald Duck, this is the Soki Kid." "Oh, what a surprise." "Hey, Donald, guess who's a brand new Soki toy?" "I don't know."
And then straight afterwards, he calls Porky Pig.
Porky Pig here.
"Guess what, Porky? You're a brand new Soki toy."
Yeah, I know, but with so many fun baths to take, where'll I find time to get dirty?
And a keen eye could tell that both Disney and Warner Brothers actually worked on the commercial, along with Clarence Nash and Mel Blanc voicing their respective characters. Now, it is true that Donald and Porky are not seen together in that commercial, but still though, this ad confirmed that the tunes of Disney and the Looney Tunes all share the same universe, decades before Roger Rabbit brought them all together. If you're a 90s kid, then you probably remember the Little Mermaid animated series that was released not long after the movie. But did you know that we were supposed to have a completely different Little Mermaid show? And not only would it have been live action, it would have been brought to us by Jim Henson. Back in 1990, Disney and Henson were developing a series called Little Mermaid's Island, where just like the animated show, it would have shown us more aquatic adventures with Ariel and her friends. But the big catch was that not only was Ariel and an updated version of Grimsby would have been played by live actors, but also all of the talking animals and fish were supposed to be portrayed by puppets designed by Jim Henson's team. And that included Sebastian, Flounder, Scuttle, Max, and Flotsam and Jetsam, along with 2 new characters, including Flounder's twin sister, Sandy, and Scales the Dragon. So why is it that we never got this show? Well, unfortunately, a few months after filming, Jim Henson unexpectedly passed away, and almost all the projects that he was working with Disney got ultimately scrapped, and only 2 episodes ended up getting created, which includes Sebastian's birthday and To Tell the Truth. But thankfully, they're not fully lost, since you could go and find them on YouTube. But I will say that I know this is not the first time that we've seen a live-action Ariel interact with her friends as puppets, but I can tell you that it is still quite a strange watch. On June of 2007, after Disney's animation division was under new management, they announced that Disney Toon Studios would stop producing any more of those direct-to-home media prequels and sequels. And as you can imagine, there were several that were in production at the time that, because of that decision, had to be immediately scrapped. In fact, there were 5 of them that were ultimately lost. These include Pinocchio 2, which would have been about Pinocchio learning about why life is sometimes unfair. Then there was Dumbo 2, which would have had Dumbo and other young circus animals trying to find their way back home. And by the way, before it was cancelled, Disney actually released a trailer for Dumbo 2 that was filled with concept art and interviews from the filmmakers. It's worth checking out to learn about what it could have been.
We're basically continuing our story as if like a day or so after the original.
The kids accidentally get themselves disconnected from the rest of the circus, and they end up in the big city.
They want to have this freedom, but they also have to try to figure out how they're going to get back home.
Then there was Aristocats 2, which would have been fully made with computer animation. After that, there was Chicken Little 2, The Ugly Duckling Story, where I'm gonna guess that this would have centered on Abby Millard. And finally, a sequel to Meet the Robinsons called Meet the Robinsons 2 First Date. And from then on, the only movies that Disney Toon Studios were able to produce were the Tinkerbell movies and a couple of Planes films, all the way up till the studio's closure in 2018. One of my favorite animated shows growing up was Ed, Edd n Eddy. I would even say that it's possibly my favorite Cartoon Network show, period. But did you know that the show was created as a result of a dare? Back in the 1990s, creator Danny Antonucci was known as one of the biggest edgelords in animation, where he loved making some of the most violent, foul-mouthed, and gross cartoons. His most notable works back then include Lupo the Butcher and The Brothers Grunt. However, after the latter got cancelled because the reception it got was more disgusting than the show itself, someone dared Danny to do something that many thought would be impossible for him to create: a kids show. And in the fashion of the Eds, Antonucci took on the offer. It wasn't until he was working on a commercial where he designed 3 particular characters that he started to increasingly like, and eventually gave them the names Ed, Ed, or Double D, and Eddie. Also, he first pitched it to Nickelodeon, but when the studio was asking for full creative control, Danny just immediately bailed out on that, and instead offered it to Cartoon Network, where they were cool with Danny taking the wheel on the show, and would go on to become one of the biggest shows that the network ever had. Have you ever had the Mandela effect? You know, when you and several others have a memory of something that didn't actually exist? Well, there was a period where SpongeBob fans believed they had that, but it turns out they were actually correct. Specifically with the classic episode, Just One Bite. Before Squidward entered the Krabby Patty vault, there was an additional scene where Squidward was caught on fire by the Krusty Krab security system. Twice. However, after the episode first aired on October of 2001, Nickelodeon decided to cut that scene out from any future airings, including on all DVD and streaming releases. The reason why they decided to cut it out was because 1, the memory of 9/11 was still very fresh, and 2, they didn't want to influence kids to mess around with gasoline and matches. However, even after that decision, there were a few countries that still aired the episode unedited, and still do so to this day, including Bengal, Serbia, South Korea, and Canada. In fact, if you found the episode on streaming in Canada, they'll still show it with that deleted scene. And now, since you've made it this far, here's the entire deleted scene that I've been talking about.
There it is, unguarded. All I have to do is... Wait, it's too easy. There must be some kind of security. This is our burglar alarm? A bucket of water? That was too easy. Hey, this isn't water. This is gas.
If you're an animation fan, then you're most likely familiar with A113, which is the classroom number at the California Institute of the Arts, where many animation legends attended and graduated. However, even though nowadays it's pretty much everywhere, where was the first use of A113? And who's responsible for it? Well, the answer is actually in the series Amazing Stories. On the episode Family Dog, which was released on February of 1987, and directed by Brad Bird, you'll notice that on the license plate of the thief's car, that is where you will find the first A113. Now, the reason why Brad Bird wanted to put in that personal Easter egg was because he wanted to include something that would be like his signature as a filmmaker. Something that says that you know it's from Brad Bird because there is an A113 somewhere. And an example that he used as a comparison is like the Al Hirschfeld drawings, where in every single one you would find a Nina. Nowadays, however, I guess it's no longer his, because now A113 has gone out of control and you can pretty much find it everywhere. In Pixar films, in Disney films, in animated films not from Disney, and even in live action. Seriously, A113 has now become much bigger than just a CalArts classroom. Looks can certainly be deceiving, and that is definitely the case with the 2014 animated movie Legends of Oz: Dorothy's Return. Now, on the surface, this may look like a cheap Wizard of Oz movie, but this is actually responsible for the biggest scam in animation history. You see, the people who are responsible for this movie are Ryan and Roland Carroll, who have a long and shady history of raising money for their movies through probably illegal ways to the point that they have received a massive amount of cease and desist letters, and Greg Centineo, who previously was just a coffee shop owner, but then became the movie's head of finances. And the way they were raising money was almost like a shot-to-shot remake of The Wolf of Wall Street, where they would make cold calls and fundraising parties in order to go and raise the money from anyone and everyone. And on top of that, the way they sold this is that this would be more than just a movie. They told them that this would become a massive franchise in the levels of Toy Story and Shrek, and that they would go on to make up to 10 of these Oz movies and a TV show. And I guess all that effort worked, especially when they were aiming to get the money of people who have zero knowledge of the movie business, because they were able to raise a total of $122 million, including $12 million for advertising. And as they would keep on telling the investors that one day they will see their money again, the movie predictably became a massive box office bomb, and all the promises of a franchise eventually faded away. As for what happened to the money, they would go into the usual stuff that scammers would get, you know, like big mansions, private jets, and stuff like that. But in the case of Greg Centineo, he was said to have used that money in order to cheat the Hollywood system in order to turn his son into a movie star. Does the name Noah Centineo sound familiar? Now, a few years back, I made a couple of videos where I chronicled the entire story of this scam. But unfortunately, since then, I haven't heard any updates since. The last I heard was that since Legends of Oz, the Carroll brothers disappeared from the face of the earth, the Centineos are still trying and failing to make Noah the next Zac Efron, and one of the main investors of the movie, John Textor, is buried in so many lawsuits because of his scams that he's pretty much spending the rest of his life in court. Maybe one day justice will be served and the investors will see their money again, and that I will return to Dorothy's Return and make that long-awaited part 3. I love The Emperor's New Groove, but if there's one thing I find more fascinating than the movie itself, it's the story of how the movie was made. And did you know that there was a feature-length documentary all about the making of The Emperor's New Groove? The feature was called The Sweatbox, and it showed how the movie went through a very tough production, especially when it started out as a completely different film than what we have today, where it was originally a more serious musical with an Incan theme and a story based on the Prince of the Pauper called Kingdom of the Sun. And only a few elements from that concept made it into the final film. And throughout the documentary, it highlights many of the challenges that the team went through, including the continuous clashes between executives and creatives, the heartbreaking switch of directors from Roger Allers to Mark Dindal, and since Trudy Styler was one of the directors, it put a lot of focus on her husband Sting, who was writing the songs. When the documentary was complete in the beginning of the 2000s, it was able to be screened at a few festivals, and it was originally intended to be a bonus feature for the DVD of The Emperor's New Groove. But the plans for the latter was scrapped, and the feature just disappeared, where for several years, it was locked deep in the Disney vault where no one could see it. That was until about a decade later in 2012, someone decided to just upload it on the internet, and now if you want to see the documentary for yourself, it's just one Google search away and you can watch it in its entirety for free. And as a fan of documentaries about animation, I highly recommend you check this one out, especially if you're a fan of The Emperor's New Groove. You'll see that there were weirder things that happen in real life than Cusco turning into a llama. As someone who grew up reading the Garfield comics, I'm definitely excited for the Garfield movie. But as an animation fan, I'm also excited for this to see the return of some Disney veterans. And one in particular is the director, Mark Dindal, who previously directed Cats Don't Dance and The Emperor's New Groove, and the Garfield movie will mark as his great comeback since Chicken Little back in 2005. But whatever happened to him during that time? Did he decide to take a long break in between? Actually, he worked on several features. They were just not lucky enough to get fully made. For several years after Chicken Little, Dindal was trying to direct his next feature film at several different studios, including DreamWorks Animation, where he was helming Me and My Shadow. It just so happened that one after another, they would end up getting scrapped. It sucks, but Hollywood can be like that sometimes. It wasn't until the Garfield movie came around where his luck turned around and he finally directed a movie that got finished. And on top of that, the movie is noted to be a reunion between Dindal and David Reynolds, who previously wrote the screenplay for The Emperor's New Groove. And another Disney veteran who worked on the film was Steven Anderson, who previously was the director of Meet the Robinsons and the 2011 Winnie the Pooh movie, on top of being one of the creative leaders of Disney's other movies afterwards, is now credited as a storyboard artist for the Garfield movie. I know Garfield isn't from Disney, but who would have guessed that his animated film has some of that magic? AI is becoming more of a dangerous threat in Hollywood. And one of the major studios is not only siding with the technology instead of the people, but they said that they're going to double down on it. And that studio is Sony Pictures. In a Sony Investors event, the CEO of Sony Pictures Entertainment, Tony Vicenquera, revealed that they will be using AI in order to cut down costs on their movies and shows. And this is going to lead to some dark consequences, which includes hundreds of jobs are going to be taken down. Now, it is true that not everyone is going to be affected by this. Safe to say that producers and directors are going to be alright, and actors and writers are guaranteed protected thanks to the deal that they got from the strikes. But do you know who's going to guaranteed be screwed over by this? Artists and animators, specifically the people working at Sony Pictures Imageworks, the ones who provide the special effects for their blockbusters, and create the animation for Sony Pictures Animation. And considering that the studio is not a unionized facility, the workers have nothing to protect themselves if the company chooses to replace them with AI. And you want to know what else? You never know which upcoming Sony project is now gonna have AI. And they got some highly anticipated films that they got in the works that now could be ruined by the technology, meaning that they could use it in the Legend of Zelda movie and all those features and shows featuring Spider-Man. However, when it comes to Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse, one of the writers and producers of the film, Chris Miller, confirmed that the movie will never use AI, and that he too is against the technology altogether, which definitely is a relief. But let's hope that's enough to not let his bosses and the Sony executives to intervene and say otherwise. It is important that we call this issue out as soon as we can, because Sony may want to use it in order to save money, but their possible dependency on AI is going to cost them far more than any film they have ever produced. It's been 90 years since Donald Duck became a legend for both Disney and cartoons, and a big part of what made him so legendary is his temper. But some might wonder, why is he always so mad? Like, why is Donald taking the role of Disney's signature angry character? Well, the answer to that is not from his first cartoon, but from his second, Orphan's Benefit. Not only was that his first cartoon where he appeared alongside Mickey Mouse, but it was also the first time that audiences get to see his true personality. In the cartoon, Donald's role can be best summarized as the main comic relief, where he was presented as self-absorbed and arrogant, but also very short-tempered and easily triggered. And his style of comedy is to be on the receiving end of slapstick, where his attitude always gets the best of him. And thanks to a large part of Donald's contribution, Orphan's Benefit became a massive hit. So much so that some say that the cartoon was a pivotal point for Disney, especially for Donald, because he would then go on to make even more appearances with Mickey, and would even go on to have his own line of successful cartoons. We may not understand Donald half the time, but how he became a legend is undeniably clear. It's time to go back into Riley's head with Inside Out 2. And just like the first movie, there were many emotions that were considered for the film, but had to be dropped. In fact, director Kelsey Mann revealed that along with the main 5, there would have been 9 new emotions that joined the headquarters. Some of these included schadenfreude, shame, guilt, and jealousy. And part of the plot would have been about Joy being overwhelmed by all the emotions simultaneously at the control panel. But ironically enough, that's also what happened to the Pixar team. It was just too much to have all these characters try to share the spotlight in this one movie. That, and no pun intended, but shame was really bringing down the mood. Which is why the team decided to cut it down to 4 new main emotions in Riley's head, which includes anxiety, envy, ennui, and embarrassment. And just like Riley as a young teenager, those are enough new emotions for the movie to handle. The early 1990s was one of the highest points in Disney Animation's history, especially when Beauty and the Beast was the first ever animated movie to be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. At that point, this motivated the team to start production on 2 new animated features, and they were ready to do better than what they did on that film. This is the case with the first movie they went to go and make. Where Beauty and the Beast was only nominated, this one was aimed to go and win that Best Picture. And they were ready to be even more bold with their craftsmanship, and push themselves to be even stronger with their storytelling, theming, social commentary, animation, and music. And most of the biggest animators they had at the time were eager to work on this film. As for the second feature they were working on, they didn't really have high hopes for it. It was more of the typical family film they would regularly make with a bunch of cute animals. It was meant more to be like the appetizer to the main course that they had in store. But when those 2 movies were released, the results were the complete opposite of what they initially thought. The big movie they were hyping up for was Pocahontas. And say what you will about that film, but it ain't no Beauty and the Beast. As for that B movie they were making on the side, that turned out to be The Lion King. Moral of the story? There's no point in making expectations, because you never know what your next big hit is going to be.